Designer babies. For 100 years, we have been imagining it in science fiction, but now we're at the point where it may become everyday reality through the technology such as CRISPR. Joining us today is Dr. Ellen Jorgensen, who will discuss how creating designer babies will soon be possible and explore the social, economic, and moral implications of editing our own evolution. Okay, Ellen, I'm so excited to have you here. If you could tell us more about what CRISPR technology is.
I think the first thing to say flat out is this is not anywhere near ready for prime time.
Mm-hmm.
The way CRISPR works is there's an enzyme called Cas9, and then there's a small piece of nucleotide similar to DNA, something called RNA, that has a pattern of letters on it. And we can artificially manufacture whatever pattern we want. And this means we can send it to any target we want. And this is something new. We've always been able to do genetic engineering, but we've never been able to do something really precise, like go in and edit just one gene. It's actually been called a word processor for genomes. It's that powerful. You can delete a letter, you can add a letter, you can take a whole part out, you can put a whole part in. That's the way the system works. So it makes a damage point, and then the repair systems come in and we sort of hijack them and convince them to make the repair that we want. And this is opening up a whole new can of worms that we've sort of been talking about this in science fiction for years. If you've ever seen movies like Gattaca.
Yeah. It reminded me of Gattaca.
Societies where there are people who are edited to be perfect and people who are not. But it's always been something like, the artificial intelligence that takes over everyone. That's always like 10 years out into the future. It's never now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guess what? It's now, because we have had the first incidence of somebody using it to edit a human baby. And let me just say that the other half of the technology that you need to know is that in order for it to work, you have to get it inside a cell. And this is fairly difficult when you're talking about an adult person. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons why cancer treatment is so difficult, because you have to target it only to the cancer cells. But in this case, if you have an embryo, which is only, maybe 16 cells or something like that, 8 cells, mm-hmm. In a Petri dish, you can reach all of those cells and load this technology into them. So nobody seems to argue with the idea that if someone is born with cystic fibrosis, that we want to go in and treat their lung cells to make them healthy again so they can breathe and they'll live. But what about treating that person as an embryo and snipping that gene completely out and replacing it with a good gene? That's where it gets a little bit dicey.
Yeah, it's frightening. So you said where's this happening? Someone's actually edited a human embryo already.
In China. So the Chinese government has made a big push to be a leader in the biotech area in many different areas, not just this. They've pumped a lot of money into research. They've given scientists large grants. They've built huge research institutions, and they're bound and determined to challenge the United States as the leader in biotech research. And as part of this, they have had a very robust program in human genetics. And they've run studies like trying to find the genetic basis of intelligence, things that have all sorts of moral implications that in their government's philosophical view, anything that would help the population be better or healthier is on the table. So it's not really coming from a Judeo-Christian tradition of, people are perfect the way they are and they shouldn't be meddled with. Mm-hmm. And so viewpoints around the world differ wildly on stuff like this. And we have to realize that as Americans, that the viewpoint isn't always the same in other parts of the world. Nevertheless, this caused international furor. The investigator who did the procedure on embryos from parents where the father was infected with HIV and the mother was not. The fetus actually had a fairly low chance of being infected with AIDS. But what he decided to do was change the genetics, and it turned out to be twin girls, change the genetics in the embryos such that the AIDS virus couldn't develop in them. And that meant changing a receptor on white blood cells. That is the main point of attack for the AIDS virus. So not only was it something that was done in a human being for the first time, but it was not a desperate medical necessity. And I think that was another thing that was disturbing about it, was that it was more of a prophylactic or a preventative edit. A lot of people were also offended by the fact that they didn't think it was particularly medically necessary. Nevertheless, the scientists went ahead and did the experiment. And we are now kind of in a stage where more and more is coming out about who knew about the experiment, where it was discussed, what was the role of the Chinese government. And it's still not completely clear. What did happen was the scientists, I think, expected to really be lauded and praised for this effort, and had planned to announce it at this large international meeting on genetic engineering of humans, which was, about not just technologies, but also morality and ethics and social implications and things like that. Mm-hmm. And what happened was the news was leaked prior to that. And when he got up and gave his presentation, he was universally condemned.
Wow.
And so China immediately issued a statement saying that it was done without their blessing, and that the investigator had violated their rules and regulations, and that steps were being taken. And he actually disappeared for a while.
Oh, wow.
And then was under some sort of house arrest. And, I'm not quite sure what his eventual fate is going to be. But to me, it was almost as if China was waiting to see how the world reacted. And when it reacted negatively, it immediately backed away. But it is coming out that the Chinese government really may have helped fund this. And he certainly discussed it with a number of American researchers before he did the research. And according to them, they all advised him not to do it. So this is spurring China to propose new gene editing regulations and all sorts of other stuff. But it's really like the horse has left the barn at this point. I just saw a report where it said that it actually might affect the intelligence of these two little girls.
The ones that were edited.
Yeah, because that gene has been somehow linked to greater intelligence or something like that. So, it really is so irresponsible to experiment on a human without many, many, many studies in related species like monkeys. And it just seems like people are so enamored with this technology, and certainly it could do a tremendous amount of good. Imagine completely wiping out diseases, genetic diseases, like devastating ones like Huntington's or cystic fibrosis, which is how most scientists are seeing this.
Right.
But then you also have the specter, of course, of eugenics, because where do you draw the line? And there was a wonderful cartoon that I saw, and I can't remember what the source was, and I haven't been able to find it, but it's a woman talking to a scientist. The scientist is so happy. He's saying, we have this technology, and now mankind will never have to suffer again from all of these terrible genetic disorders. We're going to completely eliminate all of them. For instance, no one will ever have to be born blind or deaf again. And she says, oh, like Helen Keller. And he says, and no one will ever suffer from neurological disorders. And she says, oh, like Stephen Hawking. And he says, well, no one will ever suffer from some of these psychological disorders that are now turning out to be genetic, things like schizophrenia. And she says, oh, like Vincent van Gogh. So she names all of these people in history who certainly suffered from whatever the genetic disorder was, but on the other hand, contributed just enormous amounts to society. And if they hadn't had those hurdles to overcome, the question is always, would they have made the same contribution? Would they have been the same people? And to make the choice to kind of cut off the ends of the bell curve. So if you think of the average person with an average intelligence, an average ability for athletics and creativity and everything, and then you think of people that are on those two way arms of the bell curve. There are people that are very disabled in certain areas and people that are just supernaturally good at certain things.
Right.
If you start cutting off the ends and saying, well, this is how we're going to make everybody smart, or this is how we're going to make everybody healthy, then you get this kind of monotone society. And is that dangerous in itself? I mean, you don't want anyone to suffer, but
right. Yeah.
It's a tough call. It really is.
We're not in danger of this becoming a prevalent thing where people are going to start designing and editing babies. I mean, it's just,
well, it's an interesting thought experiment because certainly the technology is not freely available. And after this, it's going to be even more carefully regulated and watched.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that a lot of the professionals who do IVF are interested in it. There was a letter that was circulated saying that this technology shouldn't be completely shut down, that it could provide relieve a lot of needless suffering. But then if you think about IVF, it's a $30,000 procedure. So
right.
Not everyone can afford that. So do you create this Gattaca society where, in this case, the people that can afford it can afford to edit not just their child, but they're editing out their entire family line into the future forever.
Right.
That gene is gone. It's going to be passed on in a healthy form to all of their progeny. So, you may have whole dynasties of people that are healthy because they can afford it, and whole dynasties of people who are unhealthy because they can't.
So what
and
is
if
that?
they can't afford it, is there a responsibility of the government to step in? Or even what if something like common disease is sickle cell anemia, and the average sickle cell patient might go into the emergency room 300-400 times in their lifetime, which is very expensive to the healthcare system. So do you mandate that person has to get a bone marrow transplant with cells that have been CRISPR'd? And that's actually a procedure that isn't an embryo editing procedure, but is something that is being tested in clinical trials right now and may become common. Well, what if you had a child that turned out to have cystic fibrosis? Or what if you knew that for some reason there was a good chance that your child would have some sort of genetic, like a condition that was dominant, and the only way that you could fix it was through genetic engineering at the embryo level? Would you do it? Would you not? Then what if it was just something that would give your child an advantage, make them smarter, make them stronger, whatever?
Right.
And one of the interesting things that I saw in that particular scenario that they mentioned was, well, would it affect your decision if everyone else was doing it?
Right.
At what point, if you did this without their knowledge or consent as an embryo or as a very small child, at what point would you sit the child down and say, you've been edited or whatever? Or would you ever tell them?
Right.
And yeah, I mean, it's a lot of sticky, wicked questions.
Very scary to think that could be the future at some point, that would be happening.
And there's actually another set of children that was edited and haven't been born yet.
Is that right?
I don't know what the other edit is. I don't think anyone has said what the other edit is. But so we're going to have several children that scientists are going to be following very closely to see whether they develop normally, whether they, in their lifetime develop cancers. But of course, that's a long range thing. And that's the thing that really makes everyone take one step back from this is, yes, theoretically, it could be a very safe procedure and it could be life-saving, but we don't really know all the ramifications yet. So really, if you're responsible, even if you're for it, you would really only advocate it in a case where there was absolutely no other option and the person was either going to die or suffer terribly, or there was just some reason that there wasn't any option. And that it would be a state that would cause terrible pain and suffering if it weren't corrected. I think that's where most people are thinking.
Where would you like to see this whole thing go?
I think I'd like to see it get rid of some of the really devastating genetic diseases. It's particularly suited because we've never had a really good way to delete a gene before. Before this, we used to have to create this sort of reverse copy, kind of this reverse doppelganger of the gene that would create something in the cell that the cell itself would destroy. But in this case, you can literally go in with this pair of molecular scissors and snip that gene out. And Huntington's disease is one of those diseases where there's a gene that makes a protein that's a very bad protein and causes all these problems. And there's really no way, you can't just put a good gene in and fix it. You have to get rid of the bad one. I certainly am all for trying to use it in people as adults, because see, you have to make the distinction between, if you edit an embryo, that means every cell in the embryo gets edited, including the cells that would be the sperm and the egg.
Even if you just edit one part of it, the whole thing.
You can't really edit one part of an embryo if it's at the stage, because we're talking about when it's just a little tiny ball of cells. And the idea is you don't want what they call mosaicism. You don't want some cells to have it and other cells not, because you can't really tell what that cell is going to become. Is it going to become an arm? Is it become a nose?
Right. Yeah.
So you want to edit all the cells. And when you do that, the cells that become the sperm and the egg get edited too. And so the edit is passed on. So that's called germline editing. And that's what we're talking about here. What's called somatic cell editing is what people are talking about in terms of treating adults for cystic fibrosis or bone marrow transplants with edited cells for people that have sickle cell, because that's only going to edit the cells that are treated. So in cystic fibrosis, you could imagine spraying something into the lung and hoping that you could make a formulation that would get the CRISPR into the lung cells and edit them. But that person will still have children that, will carry a cystic fibrosis allele. So, but nobody seems to have an issue with that, because that's just like any other treatment, really. It's just like gene editing, where they've had success with hereditary blindness. If they inject the gene into the eye, they get that to take and correct hereditary blindness in some cases.
Oh, wow.
So the controversial use we're really talking about here is taking an embryo and editing it as a germline and having that being passed down, which, several major religions forbid that expressly.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really scary thing to think about, how, like you said, it would change our society in general if we started editing people. Because like you mentioned, some of the greatest people have these disabilities or they're not perfect, and you would have a homogenous society and it would just get a little weird.
Well, it's a slippery slope and you're not really sure. So for example, one of the things that opened my eyes was I was at a conference at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and it's a conference that the students at the university participate in as volunteers. And so I had a student that was leading me from one part of this very complicated campus to another where I was supposed to speak. She was being a host, and she had a vestigial arm. And at one point she looked at me and she said, I'm really sick and tired of people talking about editing me out of the population. She said, this doesn't bother me. This is me. This is part of my identity. This is the way I am. And that really made a big impression on me.
I agree. It's because if everyone if everyone started doing it, then you would all think, well, if my kid isn't, then how is it going to happen? How are they going to grow up if they don't if there's all these questions that would come up, and it could cause.
It's also going to be hard if they ever perfect this to resist the temptation to give a child an advantage. So everybody has their own hopes for their own child, and it's very difficult to think about
which ones you would
not using something that could make your child have a smoother road in life. Technology is moving so fast these days. Regulations are always lagging behind. So it's very unclear what the regulations are going to be. And from what I understand, IVF clinics operate in a very gray area because they're not really doing research. It's not funded by the government. A lot of what is allowed and not allowed in the United States is limited at the level of government funding. So you can't do human embryo research without going through an incredibly rigorous process. But just like stem cells, when it was forbidden to use embryonic stem cells, the state of California just made its own pool of money and funded research.
Oh, interesting.
So, a lot of these things aren't illegal. They're just unfundable.
Mm-hmm.
And if you get some private person with enough money, or you get enough of a movement to create a pool of money, it may change, though. I think that this has been a wake-up call to the entire world, really.
Right. Well, it sounds like hopefully that will slow down things and we won't be living in a Gattaca society anytime soon.
But it's been done. And that, we in the United States have no control over what people in the rest of the world do. And there are places in the world that are essentially still almost the Wild West in terms of regulation on this. So they tend not to be as technically competent, but that could change with this is an era where information and technology pass over international borders extremely quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And people fly all over the world and get educated. So you can't rely on the technology being confined to Western industrialized nations or nations that have really strong abilities to police these things.
This has been really eye-opening.
Try and think through all of the societal implications of something like that and join the conversation, because I think the people that have invented this technology have been very scrupulous about trying to engage everyone in the conversation. And we live in a society where, we have people that do nothing but do science all day, and we're supporting them with our government funding, our tax dollars for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that we really have a stake in deciding how the research should play out. And I think everybody should be as vocal as possible about it.
This is when it gets kind of scary, because I feel like it's, this could be soon, like you said. So
the hurdles are technical, and we've always been really good at solving technical hurdles. And the fact that this technology, and this is something that's maybe worth mentioning, the
mm-hmm.
fact that it's gone from an experiment in a test tube, which is the first, like a piece of DNA and the system,
mm-hmm.
no cell even, and it edited a naked piece of DNA in 2012. 2012. And wow. So from that, which was only 6 years ago, to editing an actual human baby in 6 years, the trajectory of the progress of this sort of stuff is just insane. And it's unlike anything that we've ever seen before. So I think that this is it's due to a lot of different factors. The spread of information, international cooperation, artificial intelligence, a lot of high throughput experiments and computer assisted experiments. Mm-hmm. It's really a different world where progress is happening very, very fast. And it's very hard for the general public to keep up with it, but I think we really have to.
If you know someone who'd be a great fit for the show, come on over to ingeniousbaby.com and share your tips and story ideas. You are your baby's first and best teacher.